Earlier that morning, 5,000 cheap handbills had appeared on the streets of Dallas. At the top were two offset photographs of the president, one full face and one in profile. The headline read, and this is what the handbill that was handed out in Dallas said, "Wanted for treason. This man is wanted for treasonous activities against the United States." And then it offered a 7-point bill of particulars. Any hater, left or right, could find fuel in it. Hello, welcome back to my channel. I'm Jess. And if you are new, then I'd like to welcome you to the channel and I'd like to earn your subscription. Today we are starting our JFK week. All week this week we are going to be dealing with all things Kennedy. I have a stack of old vintage magazines. I have a set of 4 of these Look magazines that we are going to see how far we can get through. They are all parts of a book that was commissioned by Jackie about the assassination and the days that followed. And so we're going to see how far we can get in that to just commemorate the 61st anniversary of the JFK assassination. I also have other magazines like this one that talks about Jackie Kennedy's White House years and a few others that I think you'll be interested in. So throughout the week, just watch for those and I hope you'll join me for them. This magazine that we are looking at today is from January 24th, 1967. It is Look magazine and it features The Death of a President by William Manchester. You might be able to tell, but this magazine is tattery. I literally had a little piece just fall off right here. So it has been stored in this and I did not look at it until about 5 or 10 minutes ago. I just wanted to make sure of what we were getting ourselves into. But what we have here, I'm actually going to read you a description of this selection so that you'll understand what we are reading today. William Manchester, which I'll show to you in just a moment, began The Death of a President February 6th, 1964. So that would have been less than 3 months after the assassination. 2 years later, working through the night of March 25th, 1966, he finished the book. Between those two dates, William Manchester conducted some 1,000 interviews, compiled 45 volumes and portfolios of shorthand notes, transcribed tapes, documents, and exhibits, and wrote. For the result, the most personal, the most detailed, and the most unexpected account of the great tragedy of our generation. Turn to page 36. William Manchester, right there. And we are going to get right into it. I will tell you, occasionally we get advertisements or other articles that I think are funny. Oh, this is interesting. I remember this even from the 80s when I was a kid. This is the Capitol Record Club, where you could kind of note what albums had come out and agree to buy a certain amount for a certain price. Did you guys do that? I did. I remember doing that and like really enjoying having access to a variety of tapes when I was a kid. That's what it was tapes, but this shows albums. So that's interesting. Well, we have different, of course, letters to the editor, things like that, but we will get right to page 36. The Death of a President by William Manchester. There is Jack and Jackie on the tarmac. Not the day of the election, but perhaps, it doesn't say, but perhaps this is on the trip when she was with him. In the weeks that followed President Kennedy's burial in Arlington, his survivors were approached by several authors who wanted to write versions of the tragedy. Remembering the president's deep interest in history, the family decided that although such a book would be a further trial for them, one must be done. However, they wanted to name the writer. Jacqueline Kennedy chose William Manchester. He had not been among those who had sought the task. Indeed, at that time, she had not even met him. But she remembered that her husband had known him, had spoken warmly of him, and had read and admired several of his books. In the early 1960s, their relationship had produced a short biography, Manchester's Portrait of a President. In 1962, the Kennedys had sent copies of it to their nieces and nephews as Christmas presents. On February 5, 1964, 10 weeks after the president's death, Robert Kennedy requested Manchester to write, quote, an extensive account describing the events of and surrounding the death of President John F. Kennedy on November 22, 1963. Manchester left his position at Wesleyan University on an indefinite leave of absence. Operating out of headquarters in the National Archives, he worked 12 to 15 hours a day for 2 years, conducting a major historical investigation throughout the United States, accumulating 45 volumes of portfolios of transcribed tapes, shorthand notes, documents, and exhibits. Finally, in New England, he finished his 1,200-page manuscript. Throughout his work, the author maintained his independence as a scholar. He was on no government payroll. He received no money from the Kennedys. On the contrary, he provided that all profits from the hardcover edition of the book after the first U.S. printing should be contributed to the Kennedy Library, and that the library should receive the bulk of the proceeds from paperback and book club sales. The manuscript was submitted for comment to 5 distinguished men, all of whom had been close to the late president. The writer weighed their suggestions and incorporated most of them into the book. Only then, and with the written approval of Robert Kennedy, who had not read the manuscript, but who knew of President Kennedy's respect for Mr. Manchester and his work, did the author proceed with plans to publish. That is a note from these editors. It says, Air Force One, codenamed Angel, the ship, here it is, the ship that brought one president of the United States to Dallas and returned with 2. The Death of a President by William Manchester, Part 1. And this is a long-form section of a book. It says it's copyrighted 1967. This is a forthcoming selection of the Book of the Month Club. So we have pages and pages here printed out, and I'll read what we can to get through it in this article. I'll try to mostly do so without commentary, unless there are words that are unfamiliar or if there's just something of note. But for the most part, I will just be reading this article to you. The Death of a President by William Manchester, Part 1. Despite obvious differences in temperament and style, John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson shared one grand passion, politics. And in the autumn of 1963, a political issue was about to take the president and his vice president 1,000 miles from Washington into deepest Texas. They had no choice but to go. The state's Democratic Party was rent by factionalism. Governor John B. Connally Jr. and Senator Ralph Yarborough were stalking one another with shivs. In 1960, the Kennedy-Johnson ticket had carried Texas by an eyelash. If the governor and the senator didn't agree to a truce soon, the national ticket wouldn't stand a chance there next fall. No presidential leader writes off 25 electoral votes easily, so Kennedy was obliged to step in and patch things up. He had to make a real production of the trip, with Connally, Yarborough, Johnson, and himself appearing together in public and in apparent harmony. The prospect was unappetizing and vexing to the chief executive. It appeared to him that Johnson ought to be able to resolve this petty dispute himself. The trip seemed to be an imposition. Actually, Johnson's problems were authentic. Politically, he had become a cipher because he lacked a power base. The chasm between the president's Oval Office and the Vice President Johnson's across the street on the second floor of the Executive Office building was enormous. Newspapermen were aware of every move the first family made. The second family was largely disregarded. Mrs. Johnson had never seen the inside of the presidential plane, Air Force One. If Johnson wanted to use a plane, he had to apply to the president's Air Force aide, Brigadier General Godfrey McHugh, and sometimes, mortifying to a man of his extreme sensitivity, the request was denied. Moreover, LBJ had now become aware of groundless but persistent rumors that he might be dropped from next fall's ticket. Yes, there was speculation that he might not be the vice president on the ticket for the second Kennedy term. For Kennedy, the Texas trip brought but one consolation. His wife was going to accompany him. Her decision had come at a surprise. In the summer of 1963, Patrick Bouvier Kennedy had died in an oxygen chamber of a Boston hospital 40 hours after birth. The blow to the parents had been staggering. All fall, Jacqueline Kennedy's convalescence had been the chief concern of her husband's private life. I will need tea from time to time. And afterward, after the terrible tragedy in Dallas, she would remember how she had told him, "There's just one thing I couldn't stand, if I ever lost you." Her voice had drifted off, leaving the unthinkable unspoken, and he had murmured reassuringly, "I know, I know." She had wanted to stay with him and the children. He had a different plan. She should forget herself in other lands. His mind was made up, and so she went. The separation became a strange hiatus between tragedy and tragedy. She wrote him 10-page letters punctuated with dashes, as in everything she wrote. She told him how much she missed him, of her sorrow that he could not at the moment share with her the tension-free atmosphere of the Mediterranean. Oddly, I believe she went on the ship of the man she would later marry, Aristotle Onassis. I believe that's right. To her astonishment, the thing worked. Everywhere she was feted, and those weeks were a spectacular diversion. She returned on October 17th in far better spirits than she had thought possible. At the time of Patrick's death, it had been announced that she would rest until January 1st. Now, Dr. Walsh, her obstetrician, felt her recovery was complete, so she decided to reappear sooner. "We'll campaign," she told the president. "I'll campaign with you anywhere you want." And when he asked her whether that included the expedition with Lyndon, she flipped open her red leather appointment book and scrawled Texas across November 21st, November 22nd, and November 23rd. Kennedy was delighted. He was also nervous. He was afraid that later she would have regret having gone. He wanted her to enjoy this trip so she would make others. And he was determined that his wife should look her best in Texas. For the first time in their marriage, he asked her what she intended to wear. Dallas especially interested him. "There are going to be all these rich Republican women at that lunch wearing mink coats and diamond bracelets," he said. "Be simple. Show these Texans what good taste really is." So she tramped in and out of his room holding dresses in front of her. It's interesting. I heard there's a pastor in Dallas who said that he thought that Texas women do their hair big and do all the plastic surgery and everything more because North Texas is so flat and ugly. That was his assessment, that because nature itself is so lackluster here that women make themselves up a little more. So it's funny to read this even going back to the 1960s. "If it's so important that I look all right in Dallas," she asked, "why do I have to be blown around in a motorcade first?" He explained, exposure, like patronage, was a source of political strength. You had to be seen. You had to move through crowds, and you had to move slowly. Twice on the day before their departure for Texas, he telephoned Pamela Tenure, his wife's press secretary, to discuss the First Lady's hair. Pam suggested putting the bubble top on the car. No. Barring rain, they had to be easily seen. He and Pam discussed women's hats until the president, out of his element, reduced it to a joke. "Take a 45-minute drive around Washington in an open car with Dave Powers," he ordered. "See what you look like when you come back." That was on Wednesday, November 20th, 1963. Robert Kennedy later remembered that his brother's manner then, as indeed for the 10 previous days, had often been gloomy. Certainly he had been saturnine that Tuesday morning, the children were at Atoka, Virginia with their mother, cutting school. So he had missed his French lesson. This was a closely guarded secret. The president had decided that the most effective way to tackle Charles de Gaulle would be to learn his language, really learn it. I didn't know this. And then negotiate in it. His teacher was Caroline's French teacher. Since September, she had been tutoring the president mornings in the mansion. "How long do you think it will take me?" he had asked Madame Jacqueline Hirsch at the outset. "A year," she had replied. He couldn't resist the challenge. "I bet I'd do it in 6 months." But there was no lesson on this Tuesday, so he stalked over to the office, which was soon crackling with one appointment after another. Press Secretary Pierre Salinger entered. At midnight, Pierre would fly to Honolulu with Dean Rusk and McGeorge Bundy for a Vietnam Council of War. Then he, Rusk, and 5 other cabinet members would proceed to Japan. The press believed Pierre's trip was a joyride. It wasn't. Kennedy hadn't forgotten his predecessor's Japanese fiasco when leftist riots had forced Eisenhower to cancel a call there. He meant to restore American prestige in Japan with a February visit. Pierre's job was to set things up. Dusk gathered in the rose garden, night fell, and the appointments continued on and on. Mrs. Kennedy was still at Atoka, but the children were now back. When the last visitor of the day had departed, he took the children for a swim in the pool and retired after dinner to an evening of paperwork in the oval study on the 2nd floor of the mansion. There were the drafts of the Texas speeches, personal matters, and a new item of political significance, for 1964 pressures were building up month by month. He had a strong hunch that the GOP would yield to its death wish and nominate Barry Goldwater, but he couldn't count on such fantastic luck, so he was planning a maximum effort. If Goldwater became the sacrificial lamb, so much the better. He would vanish in a historic landslide. The president was confident of a smashing re-election. Before he left office, he felt he would be the senior statesman of the West, perhaps of the world, and he was already planning the second Kennedy administration. His brother wanted to bow out as AG. Then there was Douglas Dillon, who wanted to leave the Treasury. And there was Rusk. Aware that the president intended to be his own foreign minister, Rusk had leaned on him increasingly in other ways. After the second inaugural, the cabinet would almost certainly be headed by Secretary of State Robert McNamara. Bobby had tentatively decided that once Rusk left, he would ask to be Assistant Secretary for Inter-American Affairs. But the cabinet reshuffle could wait. His first meeting on Wednesday was breakfast with the legislative leadership. Senator Hubert Humphrey of Minnesota and House Whip Hale Boggs of Louisiana said they were disturbed over reports that there might be trouble in Dallas. Kennedy said the thought that an American president would not go into any American city was simply unacceptable. "Mr. President," Boggs said half-jokingly, "you're going into a hornet's nest." Kennedy replied absently, "Well, that always creates interesting crowds." Texas would be rough. Here, as elsewhere, the national leadership did what it could to keep the peace, but Texas scorned peace. Each county was an autonomous duchy. Each was faction-riddled. They were political cannibals, and a naive outsider venturing among them could be eaten alive. Kennedy was not naive. At the Los Angeles Convention of 1960, where Johnson had attempted to wrest the presidential nomination from him, Kennedy himself had been smitten by Johnsonian partisans who had spread rumors that he would not live out his term because he was, quote, diseased. After Los Angeles, they blandly explained that they had been referring to Addison's disease. Connally had consented to the coming trip, and for 2 weeks, guides from the Democrat National Committee had been scouting the most treacherous marshes. The president was only vaguely aware of the details of the blazing feud between Connally and Yarborough. Yet it was an old one, older than the feuders themselves. Now, just for note, whenever we're reading about Johnson and Yarborough was 4 cars behind Kennedy. Johnson was in the car directly behind Kennedy. So both of these men end up in the presidential motorcade, just so you know who we're talking about. Yarborough was a senator. He was 3 or 4 cars back in the motorcade. The origins of their feud were ideological. In the 30s, the rightist Jeffersonian Democrats and the Texas regulars had bolted FDR. In 1944, they sent a rival delegation to the National Convention. In 52, they deserted Adlai Stevenson. Encouraged by Sam Rayburn, moderate Byron Skelton, an attorney, had accepted the post of the National Committeesman. The populist heirs had staged an uprising of their own, forming a liberal faction called the Democrats of Texas, DOT. DOT's hero was Ralph Yarborough, who ran 3 unsuccessful campaigns before becoming a U.S. Senator in 1957. Raff, as he was known, was forever squabbling with other Democrats. Nevertheless, he was the only Texas liberal to hold statewide office, so that is a powerful man that even though Johnson was Texan and had gone on to be vice president, Yarborough was the only statewide Democrat to hold office. He was the only Texas liberal to hold statewide office. In LA, when the rest of the state party rallied to Johnson's favorite son candidacy, he supported John Kennedy. They punished him by refusing him a seat in the Texas delegation. The senator had to sit in the gallery as a spectator. Reprisals would have gone further, but Rayburn intervened, and then a year later he died. His calming influence vanished. So Sam Rayburn had been kind of a mediating force between Johnson and Yarborough, and he had died. The rightists were free to gang up on the populist Maverick. Furthermore, they now had a leader cut from whipcord. Johnson had never won their complete trust. His loyalties were uncertain. John Connally, however, was a priceless gift. Connally had been Johnson's administrative assistant and Kennedy's Secretary of the Navy, but now he was his own governor. So he's the governor of Texas. Outsiders still thought of him as a Kennedy-Johnson man. They were mistaken. His conservatism, like Yarborough's liberalism, was genuine. The governor was a classic example of the poor boy who had risen above his origins and despises them. Connally had acquired suavity and guile. He first became the friend of wealthy men, and then their staunch ally. Studying the hardship of the Texas poor had made Ralph Yarborough an adversary of those whom he regarded as responsible for it. Indigence itself was John Connally's enemy. As Johnson said privately, Connally felt comfortable only in $300 suits and custom-made shoes, and in the company of other men wearing them. The wall between him and his dire boyhood could never be thick enough. So that's fascinating, that Governor Connally had grown up super poor, but despised it, and as an adult chose to only associate with those who were exceedingly rich and to dress himself and present himself as if he was also exceedingly rich. So it was as if he was building a very thick wall between himself and his past. As governor, he had carefully dissociated himself from the liberals in Washington. He went all out for conservatism, and like the president, he had his eye on the coming election. Barring primary upsets, Connally and Yarborough would be campaigning with Kennedy and Johnson. The governor wanted to run ahead of the ticket. He wanted Yarborough to lose, and with that in mind, he planned to make political capital out of the forthcoming presidential tour. As chief executive of the state, he would be host to the national chief executive, presidential aide Ken O'Donnell. We've heard that name in some of our other readings, and his colleague Larry O'Brien. That's a new sentence. Presidential aide Ken O'Donnell and his colleague Larry O'Brien told all parties concerned that the governor was being dealt a big hand. The first inkling of how he intended to play that hand came early in October. Before flying east to discuss details of the trip, Connally conferred in Dallas with the city's powerful elite, J. Eric Johnson, chairman of the powerful Citizens Council, Robert Cullum, president of the Chamber of Commerce, R.L. Thornton, chairman of the Mercantile National Bank. There's a R.L. Thornton Freeway now here in Dallas. Joe Dealey, that would be related to Dealey Plaza, where Kennedy would be assassinated. So Joe Dealey, son of the publisher of the Dallas Morning News, and Albert Jackson of the Dallas Times-Herald, In effect, the governor apologized for the president's visit. He himself was in a bind, he said. He couldn't tell the chief executive not to come, but he wanted them to know that he had no intention of becoming Kennedy's errand boy. Indeed, if he used the occasion to humiliate Yarborough, Texas liberalism, might be crushed. He said, "I've got to have a non-political body to represent Dallas, and you gentlemen are it by your associations." In the Capitol on October 3rd, he called a meeting of Texans on the Hill. Yarborough was not asked, and told them that the president wanted to visit San Antonio, Houston, Fort Worth, and Dallas. Kennedy's strength in Texas, as Connally saw it, was among Negroes and brass-collar Democrats. That's a quote. Unfortunately, they were poor, and the national leadership wanted the journey to be a fundraising drive. Quote, "The people who are for Kennedy are people without money. I've checked with businessmen. They aren't about to contribute to his campaign." Henry Gonzalez, the San Antonio liberal, broke in. "What businessmen did you talk to?" he asked angrily. "If they're the ones you've been appointing," excuse me, "if they're the ones you've been appointing, I wouldn't expect them to be for Kennedy, because they are a bunch of Republicans. I'll get you businessmen. You may not like them, though, because they won't support you." Interesting. So Yarborough wasn't finding people who would support Kennedy, but this man would. The governor stuck to his theme. The following day, he took the same line with Kennedy: "Keep the presidency above politics." It was absurd. The presidency is politics. Kennedy's difficulty was that he couldn't alienate Connally. If a ceremonial tour would give the appearance of a united Democratic front in Texas, he would settle for that. On October 20th, Senator Yarborough reminded the White House that he had a record of unwavering devotion to Kennedy. Was he to be snubbed in his home state? If so, he preferred to brood in Washington. He was reassured. For Kennedy, a trip without Yarborough would be worse than no trip at all. There would be indignation among the Texas liberals and retribution in the campaign to come. Connally, meanwhile, had been busy spinning his intricate webs. Jerry Bruno, advance man for the DNC, learned of one Connally scheme to put Senator Yarborough in his place. The details are important because they involve the choice of the site where the president would speak in Dallas, and as a consequence, the motorcade route he would take. So they're going to give us the details of why the president's speaking location was chosen, and that led to the motorcade route that they chose. There were three major choices: the Women's Building, Market Hall, and the Trade Mart. Bruno preferred the Women's Building. It was rather drab, but it would attract working people. However, it developed that the low-ceilinged structure was unsuitable for one of Connally's schemes. In Dallas and in Austin, he wanted two-tiered head tables. The president, vice president, and the governor would sit at the top table. See, it's easy to see why he would want that. Lesser officials, such as the state's senior Senator Yarborough, would be relegated to the lesser table. It's interesting to see these behind-the-scenes wranglings over silly things like table tiers. Yarborough would be relegated to the lesser table. It was within Bruno's power to make a final decision on the spot. Had he insisted on the Women's Building, the Dallas motorcade would not have passed beneath the Texas School Book Depository. But because he hesitated, the matter remained unsettled. The Secret Service regarded all three sites as acceptable. The issue was bucked up to the White House, where the policy was to appease Connally, the governor. On November 14th, O'Donnell opted for the Trade Mart, though the two-tiered head table was rejected. The Warren Commission reported that the luncheon site was selected by the Secret Service with O'Donnell's approval. This is incorrect. The decision was a political decision made by politicians. Bruno was among the witnesses whom the commission did not summon. This is far from the first time that we've heard anything concerning about the Warren Commission. There was a lot that they did not investigate, and there were many things like this that were reported falsely. And you know, for something that significant, for something that amazing in our nation, they really ought to have taken more time, if need be, to make sure that every detail was properly reported. The governor was content. The stratagem would be just as effective in Austin, where he also planned a reception for the president with no invitation for Senator Yarborough. So there's definitely conflict between Connally, who you might remember was seated in front of the president and also was shot in the assassination gunshots, but Yarborough was 3 or 4 cars back. So there was definitely political rancor between the two. Chapter 2. I imagine this is probably all that we will get to today. All month, the Leonine Democratic National Committeeman from Texas, Byron Skelton, had been troubled by a premonition. Now in his late 50s, he was the epitome of Southern respectability, and 3 years earlier, he had played a leading role in staging the historic confrontation between Roman Catholic Kennedy and skeptical Protestant preachers of the Greater Houston Ministerial Association. Skelton's performance in Houston had earned the respect and the gratitude of the president. Now, however, the atmosphere in Dallas had become so highly charged by inflammatory statements that Skelton was genuinely concerned. On November 4th, he decided to act. Frankly, he wrote the Attorney General, which would be Robert F. Kennedy, he would feel better, quote, if the president's itinerary did not include Dallas. 2 days later, he wrote Walter Jenkins, Lyndon Johnson's right-hand man, expressing further misgivings about the city, and to make certain he had touched all bases, he flew to Washington and talked to DNC chairman John Bailey and Jerry Bruno at the National Committee. The upshot of all Skelton's efforts was an enormous zero. On November 8th, the AG, who knew him and took him seriously, forwarded his letter to O'Donnell, but Ken decided it was an unsupported hunch. No one, including Byron Skelton, dreamed that Kennedy would be killed in Dallas, though there were many who feared that he might be embarrassed. The Dallas mood was no secret. The most casual newspaper readers knew that it had a history of ugly incidents. In the 1960 campaign, a mob of Dallas housewives had sprayed the Lyndon Johnsons with saliva. Ew. Most recently, UN Ambassador Adlai Stevenson had been assaulted on UN Day, October 24th. The following day, Presidential Assistant Arthur Schlesinger Jr. telephoned the ambassador. Stevenson said he had been shocked by the hatred in Dallas. He seriously wondered whether the president should go. He later called back to withdraw his objections. Since leaving Dallas, Schlesinger concluded Stevenson had regained his perspective. Perhaps it was just the other way around. The closer an observer was to Dallas, the graver was his concern. Presidential advisors who knew Dallas by reputation thought there might be a few boos. Perhaps the most clear-cut warning to the president himself came from Senator J. William Fulbright of Arkansas, a liberal from a state that borders Texas. Because of the city's history of political violence, he deeply distrusted it. He was afraid, physically afraid, and he readily admitted it. On October 3rd, the day before Kennedy's final planning conference with Connally, Fulbright pleaded with the president to bypass Dallas. Dallas is a very dangerous place. I wouldn't go there. Don't you go. In Dallas itself, there was genuine alarm. Both newspapers ran editorials calling for restraint. Police Chief Jesse Curry publicly put Dallas on notice that his department would take immediate action to block any improper conduct. He drew on every available reserve. The city glittered with badges. There was a chorus of warnings, and then there was a catastrophe. Between the two lies an abyss that can never be adequately explored. 10 months after the tragedy, the Warren Commission found, quote, no evidence, end quote, of any connection between the crime of Lee Harvey Oswald and the city's, quote, general atmosphere of hate, end quote. The finding was a consensus. Individual commissioners had strong reservations. The verdict was influenced by expediency. Just to make sure we're all on the same page, the Warren Commission was the group of men who were gathered together by Lyndon Johnson, headed by Earl Warren, the Supreme Court Chief Justice. And they did a 10-month investigation of the Kennedy assassination. They interviewed hundreds of witnesses. produced thousands of pages of evidence, and there are still, to this day, I have a book right there that goes through some of the problems of the commission report, but there are so many who believe that it was hastily done, that it was a preconceived outcome, that they were trying to avoid any connection with Russian or Cuban involvement, and so they had a particular angle that they were seeking from the start. Whether or not you believe that, clearly it is not an out-of-bounds position that there were problems with the Warren Commission. He's outlining some of them. The verdict was influenced by expediency. The commission's members hoped their report would receive the widest possible acceptance. A majority believed that conjecture about Dallas might tend to discredit their other findings. Therefore, they hedged. They acknowledged that the assassin had known of Dallas's political tension, but concluded that there was no way to judge what the effect of the general political ferment present in that city might have been, even though Oswald was aware of it. The key word here is judge. Obviously, it is impossible to define the exact relationship between an environment and an individual. If we discuss it, we are speculating, but legitimate speculation is one of the duties of historians. Their sources cannot be confined to fingerprints, ballistic tests, and spectrographic examinations. To be sure, the Dallas assassin did not belong to a conventional criminal conspiracy. Lee Oswald was called a loner, but nearly everyone seized upon the word to describe him and also to explain him. They were all wrong. It is true that he had a one-track mind. The mind of every assassin runs on a narrow-gauge track, yet no man lives in a void. His every act is conditioned by his time and his society. John Wilkes Booth was not an agent of the Confederacy. Despite early assumptions, he had acted on his own. But his victim was murdered at a critical hour in our history in a city swarming with Southern sympathizers and hardened by seditious talk. Establishing the precise link between a deed, era, and locale is a hopeless task. Yet to suggest that there was no relationship, that the crime in Ford's Theater could have been committed in a community untroubled by crisis, is ridiculous. In the third year of the Kennedy presidency, there was something in Dallas unrelated to conventional politics, a disease of the spirit, a shrill, hysterical note suggestive of a deeply troubled society. Texas led the United States in homicide, and Big D led Texas. That's a nickname for Dallas, Big D. There were more murders in Dallas each month than in all England. Furthermore, nearly 3 out of every 4 slayings were by gunfire. Big D had no requirement for firearms registration. Before November 22nd, there had been 110 murders committed in Dallas in 1963. Dallas had no corner on presidential hate, but it was the one American metropolis in which incitement to violence had become respectable. The origins of its implacable hostility to the new frontier lay in a profound longing for the values, real and imagined, of the old frontier. No one could honestly depict John Kennedy as a plainsman. His private wealth and starchy New England vowels were bad enough. The ultimate outrage, however, was his challenge to Dallas's tribal instincts. The president was a thoughtful man. On yesterday's frontier, the man who paused to think didn't survive. Kennedy called for diversity, tolerance, nonconformity. In pioneer society, everyone stuck together and circled the wagons against the Indians. So the Eastern stranger was a threat. Well, that's an interesting assessment, isn't it? It's strange to consider the ways that old thinking would have influenced even moments like this, but it does seem feasible. Moreover, the germ of piety was very real, and the thunder of moral indignation is clearly evident in the editorials of the Dallas Morning News, whose anti-administration crusade was the key to Big D's absolutism. The publisher and chairman of the board was E.M. Dealey, a heavy man with green-tinted spectacles, who also owned Dallas's television station, WFAA. Under Dealey's leadership, the news had made radical excesses reputable in the early 1960s. In the 2 months before the presidential trip to Texas, his paper was mounting an all-out assault on John Kennedy to blacken his name. I'm just going to hold this up really fast. There is a code decoder for all of the Secret Service code names in 1963. If you'd like to screenshot that, you can. That's an interesting thing to have access to. I'll continue reading. Before breakfast on Thursday, November 21st, the president drew on his back brace, laced his shoes, the left one of which had a 1/4-inch medical lift, slipped into the clothes his valet had selected, anchored his conservative tie with a bright PT boat clip, and pocketed a black leather wallet with $26 in bills and a gold St. Christopher medal that was fastened to it. He looked like a successful, confident American father about to embark on a crucial business trip, which is precisely what he was. "Caroline," he called. "John." They came running, John in plaid shorts, Caroline in a blue leotard and a blue velvet dress. Their mother was having her hair combed, and so they had him pretty much to themselves at breakfast, babbling excitedly as he rifled through the newspapers. At 9:15, the president's daughter had to go to school. She embraced him, whispered, "Bye, Daddy." "Bye, Caroline," and was gone. In the West Wing, the president rang for his secretary, Evelyn Lincoln. "How about this weather report?" he asked. He waved Brigadier General Godfrey McHugh's forecast. "I want that checked." At 10:42 a.m., she came back with bad news. The next 2 days in Texas would be hot. "Hot?" Kennedy cried in dismay. He lunged for his telephone and dialed his wife's maid's extension. "Pack some cool dresses," he said urgently, but it was too late. The dresses were already in the helicopter. Kennedy hung up and swore mightily under his breath, all his precautions to make certain that his wife would have a good time. And now, debacle. He pictured her riding in the Dallas motorcade, perspiring in that pink suit. McHugh had blundered. He had promised cool weather. Her suit was made of wool, I believe. He had mobilized every veteran meteorologist in the government, had assembled reports from the U.S. Weather Bureau, from Andrews Air Force Base, and from the Weather Bureau at the chief executive's destination. Data had been accumulated on the present, and on the unpredictable future. It was all very military. Unfortunately, it didn't work. Kennedy's blood was up. He dialed McHugh's extension, chewed him out, and summoned O'Donnell. It's interesting because DFW area, I live here, the DFW area is notoriously difficult to predict weather for. We tend to have 1 or 2 weathermen that we actually trust, but because it's a plain, weather can sweep across very quickly, and it is very common in these months of, say, this is November, but October to February, for there to be months that or weeks that feel like summer, and within a week or 2 weeks that feel like the dead of winter. And it's very difficult to know for sure which kind of weather you're going to have in these months. So whoever he checked with, we can forgive them because it is difficult to predict Texas weather. It's particularly North Texas weather. "Damn it, Kennedy, let's check with the local airports from now on," he stormed. "Or let Mrs. Kennedy do it. Or let Mrs. Lincoln do it. She's accurate. She's also cheaper." He swore again. "Hot. Hot. Jackie's clothes are all packed and they're the wrong clothes." A third oath. He rose and left the office. On the mansion's second floor, he met his wife's maid. "Get John," he said. "I want to take him with me." In moments, the delighted little boy was snug in his tiny London fog raincoat and sou'wester, which actually resembled a miniature army fatigue hat. At the helipad, most of the Texas party had already gathered, together with a handful of well-wishers who had strolled out from the West Wing offices to see them off. Evelyn Lincoln, military aide Major General Ted Clifton, and 3 agents were already aboard helicopter number 1. Young John joined them. Presidential physician Dr. George Berkeley was on number 2. Assistant Press Secretary Mac Kilduff was in number 3 with reporters of the White House press pool. Kennedy, bareheaded in the drizzle, vaulted into number 1. Out of the rose garden, Mrs. Kennedy appeared. She scrambled aboard in a 2-piece white wool boucle dress and a coat. Just the thing for a chilly day. Her husband took a sharp breath and glared at McHugh. The rotors began to spin. In the autumn of 1963, the White House telephone number was still national 81414. And when the man of the house was home, communications were relatively simple. But the moment the chief executive left his helipad, all that changed. Elaborate security precautions went into effect. Even names were altered. Code replaced them. From time to time, names and groupings were changed. One man, who was Porter in 1963, later became Super and then River. The White House was no longer the White House, it was Castle. And during a trip, the precise location of the president at any given moment was charcoal. He himself was no longer John Kennedy. He was Lancer, who was married to Lace, and whose children were a daughter named Lyric and a son named Lark. The first family was all in the L's. Secret servicemen were in the D's. W's were for staff. V's were reserved for the vice president and his family. Lyndon Johnson was volunteer. Lady Bird, who had never had much luck with names, became Victoria. Tourists thought of the president's home as stationary at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. They were wrong. The White House was wherever Lancer happened to be, and when he traveled, the key switchboard was a jungle of color-coded wires in the executive mansion's east basement, manned by elite Signal Corps technicians of the White House Communications Agency. At Andrews Air Force Base, Chopper No. 1 settled down beside the immaculate splendor of Air Force One, aircraft 26,000. John's mother and father hugged him. "I want to come," he told his father. "You can't," the president said gently. The little boy began to cry. The president kissed his son for the last time and patted the trembling shoulders in the small raincoat. That's sad. Then he looked at the agent who would be staying behind. He said, "You take care of John, Mr. Foster." It's impossible not to call to mind that little boy about a week later, saluting his daddy's coffin. Terribly sad. Earlier that morning, 5,000 cheap handbills had appeared on the streets of Dallas. At the top were 2 offset photographs of the president, one full face and one in profile. The effect was that of a Bertillon, I don't know that word, police poster. The headline read, and this is what the handbill that was handed out in Dallas said, "Wanted for treason. This man is wanted for treasonous activities against the United States." And then it offered a 7-point bill of particulars. Any hater, left or right, could find fuel in it. Significance may be exaggerated, however. There was no connection between the president's assassin and its printers. And Kennedy's Dallas enemies were already aflame anyhow. W.E. Greiner Junior High School announced that students could go to tomorrow's motorcade, provided that their parents came for them. One teacher told her pupils, "Nobody here will be let out for that parade. I don't care if your whole family shows up. You're not going. I'm not going, period." She smiled faintly, a smartly dressed young woman in her mid-20s. "If I did see him," she said, "I'd just spit in his face." An hour later, the first edition of, we'll continue on page 47, the first edition of the afternoon Times Herald hit the streets. Sometimes the printing has the words pressed super close together, and so when I'm stumbling sometimes, just please be gracious, because the typeset is probably still the old typesetting that they would do, where the keys were pushed together or pulled apart depending on the space of the column. One of the clerks at the Texas School Book Depository brought a copy and ran inside, waving the newspaper map of the motorcade route. The president's car was going to pass beneath their windows, cruising slowly toward the triple underpass. Aircraft 26,000 departed Andrews at 11:05 Eastern Standard Time. Colonel Jim Swindle was a rakish Alabamian with a Terry and the Pirates profile, and he had a dream plane to fly. 100 tons of gleaming machinery, exquisite appointments, and air-conditioned, soundproof cabins. That morning, the president unbuckled his worn black alligator briefcase and spread the contents on the stateroom desk. He was studying diplomatic cables marked, "Eyes Only, President." Across the aisle, his wife and Pam Turner were working on a speech. It was to be the only one she would deliver in Texas and would be quite brief. Since she was going to appear before the LULACs, the League of United Latin American Citizens, she had decided to speak in Spanish. In the stillness of the stateroom, her soft Castilian could be heard clearly. In the staff area, forward, Ralph Yarborough was embattled. In the last few days, he had learned the details of the trap Governor Connolly had laid for him. The more he thought about it, the more wrathful he became. Connolly and Johnson, for he held the vice president guilty as a co-conspirator, were, in his opinion, as black as a Republican heart. Jim Mathias, a pool reporter, asked about the Austin reception. Remember, they hadn't given Yarborough an invitation. Yarborough snapped, "Well, I'm not surprised. Governor Connolly is so terribly uneducated governmentally. How could you expect anything less?" Now, the vendetta was on the record. Once 26,000 landed, the quote would be relayed to the press. And we will leave it there. We do get to chapter 3 here. And I see chapter 4 is also here, and then it will be continued in the next. So we'll probably try to do roughly 2 chapters per episode this week, and we will work through whatever we can of this series, The Death of a President. I hope you enjoyed it. I did too. Look, here's a little piece that fell off. I'm going to put it back in its plastic to protect it, but let me know in the comments what you thought of this article. You can tell he's clearly a historian. You can tell his goal is to tell the truth. He's told the truth about the Democratic wranglings that were happening. He's told the truth about Kennedy being angry at certain points. And then, of course, the problems with the Warren Commission. So it's going to be interesting, I think, to go through this story together. Y'all let me know what you appreciated. Let me know what stood out to you. And I will see you tomorrow for more Kennedy Week. Have a good day.